I think now is finally the right time for me to answer the question, which Halo is the best? Halo Infinite has been out for 18 months, I played all 8 mainline games in the series through again over the past year, and I've spent most of my free time writing about them too. Now all that's left to do is choose my number 1, as well as the unfortunate title propping up the bottom of my list. If you enjoy this longer form content and want to see more of it, do consider subscribing, following the channel on social media and supporting it via Patreon. Links are in the description, and with that, let's get cracking. It probably won't come as a massive shock to learn that one of 343 Industries' efforts is my least favourite game in the series. For a brief period of time at least, I actually eagerly awaited the release of Halo 5 Guardians. I wasn't the biggest fan of 4 and so still had some reservations, but 5's Hunt the Truth marketing campaign focusing on Oni, the perception of Master Chief, Locke's pursuit of him, and many other parts of the Halo universe besides was absolutely brilliant. Seriously, it's one of the best pieces of video game marketing I've ever encountered. When I finally got my hands on the game, I was generally very disappointed. Any nuance, any sense of the game's story being a slow burn mystery like trailers and other promotional material had hinted at had all but been erased. In their place was an opening cinematic I know some like, and admittedly it is eye-catching, that to me didn't feel like the relatively grounded Halo I was used to. It was more Marvel movie than military sci-fi. That cutscene is then swiftly followed by opening level Osiris, which isn't an improvement. I was hoping 343 had listened to the community's complaints about 4 moving too far away from the series' traditional formula, but what I experienced during that first mission was essentially 4 again, but with shinier graphics and superior movement. That pretty much sums up my thoughts regarding 5, actually. Where 343 had an opportunity to course correct in between releases, to get Halo back on track, what they instead did was double down, creating a title that feels like a sequel to 4 but not to Bungie's earlier entries. It certainly looks pretty in places and plays fairly well, I'll give 5 that, but most of the rest of it is incredibly underwhelming. As mentioned, Hunt the Truth takes a back seat and is often nowhere to be seen, and the climactic moment we do get between Master Chief and Locke is frankly laughable. The game transitions from Spartans flying through the air like superheroes at its beginning to a sluggish, poorly choreographed fistfight that is just the worst. There are other issues narrative-wise too. Cortana's return after an elegantly handled farewell at the end of Halo 4 was unnecessary, and introducing an entirely new group of Spartans in the form of Fireteam Osiris was a risk that didn't pay off. The game's story is such a mess with so much going on and so many characters involved that nowhere near enough time is spent fleshing out the new group. Like the story, 5's gameplay lacks cohesion too. You constantly jump between Blue Team and Fireteam Osiris and never spend very long in one location, which makes proceedings feel jarring at the best of times. The Breaking is a horror show which may well be the worst level in the entire franchise, and the various boss fights against the Warden Eternal are terrible. In fact, fighting the Prometheans in general continues to exasperate following a poor debut in 4. On balance, they might be ever so slightly less of a misery to take on than in their maiden outing, but they are still bullet sponges with infuriating abilities who are zero fun to fight. Every now and then, you do get a glimpse, just a glimpse of what could have been. The added mobility Chief and Locke are afforded is a welcome addition, and the levels have clearly been designed to make the most of your newfound manoeuvrability. It can be quite enjoyable to actually play at times. Blue Team, Swords of Sanghelios and Battle of Sunayon are great missions too, levels I'm more than happy to replay on the rare occasion I revisit Halo 5. As much as I dislike how the game's plot plays out, I also don't hate the concept of the created. With better execution, it could have been an intriguing storyline, and speaking of AI, Exuberant Witness was a great inclusion to the cast as well.
Exuberant, what is...
Constructors. This is a builder facility after all. I was installed by the builders. I serve the builders.
No! Stop it!
You took my installation. I will take something of yours.
Done!
The big problem is that for every up, there are 5 downs, and what you're left with is a game which, to me, often feels like a flashy, surface-level take on Halo. If you like fancy graphics and enormous set pieces, you may be temporarily wowed, but the more you play, the quicker you'll realise that it lacks any real depth. The title taking the position of not quite last place is another 343 Industries developed offering, this time Halo 4. I know a lot of this video's runtime so far has been me complaining, so this time let's start with the positives. The biggest one is Halo 4's story. When it was announced that Master Chief would be returning to the series, I wasn't overly surprised. Halo 3 ends with Chief left adrift in space, and while part of me had hoped that the story might move away from humanity's saviour for a while so that he could later return triumphantly when least expected, I was never going to complain about spending more time with him. I needn't have worried either, as the game's story is a good one which begins what should have been another trilogy quite well. A new villain makes his mark on the series in the form of the Didact, and the story of the Forerunners is greatly expanded. There's even a surprise or two regarding the history of humanity as well. If I were to criticise 4's plot, it does rely too much on having knowledge of events outside the games, and once or twice there are ridiculous exposition dumps which are incredibly heavy-handed, but in general I was intrigued enough by the end of the game that I was looking forward to finding out what was going to happen next. In particular, the parts of the story centred on Master Chief and Cortana are 4 at its strongest. 343 uses their relationship to explore Chief, and indeed Cortana's humanity, and the idea of self. It's expertly handled from start to finish.
They'll pair you with another AI. Maybe even another Cortana model if Halsey lets them.
That's not going to happen.
It won't be me. You know that, right?
Cortana's send-off at the end of the game was absolutely flawless too. She leaves the series on a high note, and Chief is clearly devastated, but equally you're able to find solace in the idea that he has managed to grow as a person thanks to her being in his life. It's possibly the best thing 343 have done during their time with the series, and I still cannot believe they messed it up just one game later by turning Cortana into a relatively generic baddie. Another plus point is Halo 4's visuals. They aren't as impressive nowadays as they were when it released, but back then it was one of, if not the most, graphically impressive games available on consoles at the time. I'm not a huge fan of the numerous changes made to Halo's art style, but there can be no denying that in terms of raw visuals, it was gorgeous. Honestly, when playing at 4K resolution and 120 frames per second in the present, you could still mistake it for a much newer title than it actually is. Everything I've spoken about so far is top tier, so it's a shame that so many other parts of 4 overshadow its best features. My biggest problem with the game is the sweeping changes made to the series' gameplay fundamentals. To me, Halo's gameplay has always been about mixing on-foot and vehicular combat across a perfectly paced mix of narrow and wide environments designed to take full advantage of the rich sandbox on offer. What you get instead is something that feels far more Call of Duty-like in its execution. Gone are the days of being able to choose how you approach many situations, replaced by clearly defined sections where there's normally always a preferred way to tackle each. There are parts where you have to use a ghost, parts where you have to use a mantis, parts where you go on foot, parts where you fly a broadsword, and the list goes on and on. Everything is chunked out into smaller sequences you work your way through one after the other, which means a lot of the fluidity present in earlier titles is completely absent. The Covenant also aren't as fun to fight as they were in the past. It seems crazy that would even be an issue given the 5 games preceding 4 didn't have that problem, and the Prometheans are downright awful. I will never understand how anyone thought they were enjoyable to take on, or how they made it through playtesting without being fixed. There's a real scarcity of ammo for most weapons, which would have been an issue even if the Prometheans weren't in 4, but with them included, it's a complete nightmare. You spend way too much time scavenging guns containing barely any ammo and unloading into enemies which lack even a basic personality, and wonderfully, Watchers will also revive fallen foes should you not make them a priority target during firefights. I remember being so excited when they first appeared.
Set a waypoint out of the tower. Cortana?
How did... Quick! Into the portal!
But that sense of wonderment did not last very long at all. Finally, the level design in Halo 4 frequently isn't all that good. Sections taking place outdoors can be tolerable, but anything involving Forerunner structures is painful to get through. If you thought Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary's Forerunner aesthetics were awful, then 4's will also surely evoke similar feelings. They are too busy and very repetitive in equal measure. You're going to spend a whole lot of time fighting through areas that are structurally uninteresting and visually unappealing too. An awful combination. That I rate Halo 4 above Halo 5 despite my numerous complaints is more testament to how bad 5 is rather than 4 being of high quality. The difference maker between them, I think, is the story. Where 5 had me feeling very little by the time it concluded, 4 had some actual substance and I wanted to find out more. One of them left me ready for the next entry in the series to begin, while the other left me feeling indifferent, and I think that says it all. If there's one game which had the potential to place significantly higher on this list, it is undoubtedly Halo Infinite. Infinite was billed pre-release as a return to what Halo is all about, albeit with an open world that I was in two minds about. Huge maps littered with a million generic things to do might be some people's bag, but I just couldn't see how it would benefit a series which had never needed anything like that in the past. I was right to be worried too, because on balance, Infinite's open world is rather soulless. There may be a period towards the beginning of the game where it doesn't feel like that though. After getting through a couple of linear introductory levels in the form of Warship Gabrakan and Foundation, you're let loose to roam Zeta Halo as you see fit, working your way through the story or indulging in the various side activities. The problem is that any hope the game wouldn't get up to any of Ubisoft's famous open world shenanigans or copy the million other titles like them were quickly shattered. Once you've rescued a few groups of Marines, cleared a banished base or two, or hunted down a few of the high value targets, you've basically seen it all. The environments they're situated in may change a bit and the lineups of enemies may differ, but you're never going to be that surprised by anything you encounter. Like many other games, Infinite's open world then becomes a tick box exercise as you dutifully make your way around the map doing the same few things over and over again. Honestly, that wouldn't even be so much of a problem if the campaign was one in the mould of Bungie titles of old, but here too 343 Industries falls foul of repetition. You'll spend a lot of time exploring Forerunner structures, completing objectives which involve doing one thing 3 or more times before you can progress, something which creeps into the missions which occur outdoors too.
The Banished are mobilizing in a big way. Clock's ticking, Chief. How much longer?
One gun down. 2 more to go.
There is the odd success story. Warship Gabrakan, Pelican Down and House of Reckoning I always enjoy, but in general Infinite's campaign is just as uninspiring as the world it takes place within. The reason I mention the game's potential up front is because in gameplay terms, it is by far and away the best 343 have managed, rivaling even Bungie's work. Infinite feels absolutely amazing to play. It's got a great mix of weapons, most of which are satisfying to use, movement is buttery smooth, and the controls are highly responsive. Combined with the grapple shot and the insane amount of utility it provides, it won't be long before you're zipping round the battlefield with ease, performing sequences of actions which would never have been viable previously. Does the grapple shot become too much of a crutch due to its usefulness? Probably. You'll likely use it more than any of the other equipment included in Infinite, but equally I can't mark the game down for it as it's incredibly entertaining to use. Infinite's aesthetic is top draw as well. Taking my first steps out into the world of Zeta Halo, I couldn't help but think of Combat Evolved's second mission Halo, except this time there was no linear path to follow. I could go anywhere. Visually, it is exactly how I'd expect a graphically more impressive installation to look, which makes it such a shame there is no diversity when it comes to biomes. The Forerunner structures are brilliantly done too, with an aesthetic that brings them up to date and makes them look futuristic without going overboard. I'm even a massive fan of Master Chief's new armour, which again has been modernised in just the right ways. It might be my favourite of them all. Added to this is a soundtrack which is more often than not very good. There are some forgettable numbers, but plenty of absolute bangers with them, and it's an OST I revisit a whole lot more than 4 or 5's. Alas, all that good work on the visuals and soundtrack is wasted in one regard, as while Infinite's cinematics usually look and sound great, the story that plays out in them really isn't. With 343 once again deciding to abandon much of their previous work, the game marks the start of a new chapter for the franchise. Cortana is already long gone by the time Infinite begins, as is Atriox, the leader of the Banished, who leaves Chief adrift during its opening. The Guardians are also but a distant memory, and there is not a single Promethean in sight. While it does mean a fresh start for the series, it also means Infinite feels like the middle chapter of a story which lacks a beginning and an end. What happened prior is continually referenced, but you never get to see it, and then at the end of the game you might have been expecting to finally take on the Endless proper after hours of hints, but instead the credits roll, leaving you dissatisfied. The Weapon and Echo 216 are decent characters at least. They can be grating earlier on in the experience, but by Infinite's midway point they had grown on me enough that I was actively looking forward to seeing them again.
I should have protected Cortana. Stopped everything from going wrong. I failed her. I will not fail you.
Chief. Wait. We're going to make it. We have to.
In the end, I think Infinite suffered greatly because 343 tried to do too much. Not only did they attempt to rework Halo's story and introduce a host of new characters and concepts, but they also tried to attach those to an open world designed to take advantage of the new equipment on offer. It's frustrating, as the gameplay at its core is top notch, and it is by far 343's best effort with the series. I actually came away from the campaign excited to see what would come next, as with the fundamentals nailed, it was clear which areas had room for improvement. Sadly, given the state of the franchise, we may never get the follow-up which had the potential to tick all of the boxes. I feel a bit bad for Halo 3 ODST. Make no mistake, it's a cracking game I revisit regularly, but as a title which was developed by a smaller team with a smaller budget, it was always going to struggle against Bungie's heavy hitters, which had the full weight of the studio behind them. It being the lowest ranked of Bungie's work on my list is by no means a damning indictment of its quality, however. In fact, I'd say it punches above its weight. After a trilogy which focused on the exploits of a singular Spartan across campaigns that all followed the same basic structure, that of a number of long levels you move through linearly from beginning to end, ODST feels extremely unique in its setup. Straight away you're introduced to the Rookie and an entire team you'll get to know better over the course of the game, an immediate shift away from the one-man saving the world narrative you may have become accustomed to. Then, once you arrive in the city of New Mombasa after landing with a bump, you're left completely alone to search for your squad mates and explore the city at your leisure, and after finishing the game's first 2 missions, you can tackle the next 4 in whatever order you choose. That sense of mystery, the isolation you feel, and the more open structure than past titles is vital, as it sets up what Halo 3 ODST is really all about, telling a film noir detective story set in the Halo universe. It's a bold, beautiful experiment which works far better than it really has any right to. The game lives and dies with New Mombasa and the tone it sets. If the city didn't evoke the right emotions or felt unrealistic, then ODST would have been something of a failure. Fortunately, it does its job perfectly, with its empty streets, moody lighting and environmental details making you feel nothing like the Spartan you were in Halo Combat Evolved 2 and 3. You feel powerless and alone by comparison, as you would in that situation. The frankly stunning soundtrack used during the city segments, and indeed the OST as a whole, also has no business being as exceptional as it is, in a title many consider to be more of a side story. Watching the Rookie inspect items left behind by his squad mates as the game's frankly stunning jazz soundtrack kicks into gear make up some of my fondest Halo memories. They still give me shivers to this day. As for the missions themselves, well, they're equally interesting too. Rather than the majority being a smorgasbord of lots of different types of Halo gameplay within a single level, like most are, each of them instead focuses on doing one thing in particular. Tiari Plaza, for example, is all about on-foot combat, Kazingo Boulevard lets you run rampant in a Scorpion, and NMPD HQ puts your sniper skills to the test. They all last a maximum of 20 minutes, often less, which helps them integrate smoothly into the game's overarching structure. You bounce fairly quickly between stints in New Mombasa and the missions themselves, creating an even rhythm that ensures your investigation remains continually engaging. It must also be noted that with the introduction of the group dynamic comes a change to the tone of the story. Dialogue on the whole feels snappier, especially Buck's.
Oh, Lord, that thing stinks. Kind of reminds me of like... What was that for?
Abandoning the mission.
What mission? You dropped off the grid. My squad was scattered. And that?
For coming back.
There's also a little bit of a love story sprinkled in, and while your actions do ultimately prove useful to humanity's war effort, there are no big victories or shocking revelations. It's a more intimate tale than you might have expected. Given ODST is meant to be a detective story, the crisp dialogue and romantic leanings fit well into the story thematically. Speaking of ODST's plot, let us also not forget about the side story involving Sadie and Disha and the Superintendent AI who helps you find her audio logs and guides you around New Mombasa. Neither would work well in a conventional Halo title, but they're a lovely oddity in ODST which actually have a payoff as well. There is an additional scene in Data Hive which you're only able to witness if you've gathered all the collectibles. I do have to mark ODST down for a couple of reasons. First, because it feels to me like stealth should have been much more of a focus, at least during your travels through New Mombasa. I spoke about feeling alone and powerless earlier, and you definitely do, but during combat it does sometimes still feel like you're controlling a character whose resilience and combat prowess aren't too far off that of a Spartan. Making avoiding enemies a pivotal part of the experience, I think would have alleviated that issue somewhat. Also, I would have liked New Mombasa to have been used a bit more effectively. There are the aforementioned audio logs to collect, and you're often never too far from a vehicle, a new weapon or two, or both. However, I would have also enjoyed seeing a few more scripted moments or set pieces occur to make the city feel a touch more dynamic than it is at present. All in all, Halo 3 ODST sets out to do something specific and generally gets it spot on. It's tightly paced, it oozes atmosphere, and it's a great game to jump in and out of if you only fancy a quick bit of Halo. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I would be over the moon if an ODST 2 was ever announced in the future, as the format still has a huge amount of potential. This next entry, I think, will be the most controversial on my list. Discounting Halo 3 ODST and looking only at Bungie's big budget releases, I have always considered Halo 2 to be the studio's weakest title. I will also add the caveat here that this video is only looking at each game's campaign and doesn't include their multiplayer offerings. Halo 2 was revolutionary in that regard and would place much higher on this list if we were accounting for both. Out of all of Bungie's work, no Halo has a more even split in terms of quality than 2. It is a game that has an utterly amazing story and excels in the way it presents that story to you, but at the same time, for me, it's the one I generally enjoy revisiting least from a gameplay perspective. Let's talk about the more cinematic side of things first. When it comes to Halo 2's story, Bungie knocks it out of the park. As with any trilogy, the middle part of the trio is often the one with the most interesting plot, and that's certainly true of 2. The story and characters have already been introduced in part 1, and there's no worrying about wrapping things up, which in turn means building out the world and those who inhabit it can be much more of a focus. I'm not by extension implying that Halo Combat Evolved's story was simplistic. In fact, it was relatively involved compared to the majority of its peers, but where its characters were concerned, there was definite room for improvement given they were built from familiar archetypes such as the stoic hero or wisecracking sidekick. Not only did Bungie continue to build out everyone remaining on the roster from the original, but they managed the amazing feat of introducing a staggering number of additional cast members as well. The Arbiter, the Three Prophets, Tartarus, Gravemind, the list is a long one, and it's testament to the quality of Bungie's writing that they were able to include such an expanded set of characters without proceedings becoming overly complicated, considering how much more complex the story was, focusing much more on the machinations of the Prophets and the Covenant's inner workings in particular, and that Bungie had to account for you playing as the Arbiter, a decision which wasn't altogether popular at the time. That is a very impressive feat. It is ridiculous how many of the series' most memorable moments come from two. Chief attending the medal ceremony while the Arbiter is punished for his failings, Chief returning the Covenant's bomb, the drop to Installation 05, and of course your first meeting with the Gravemind.
Relax. I'd rather not piss this thing off.
Demon. This one is machine and nerve, and has its mind concluded. This one is but flesh and faith, and is the more deluded.
There are plenty of other cinematics littered throughout the series I hold dear, but no other Halo comes anywhere close to matching the irresistible mix of quality and quantity on display. Actually playing Halo 2 is where I think things begin to fall flat. Before we get to why, it's worth acknowledging that there were a lot of improvements made to the sandbox which added a wealth of new options to choose from while battling the Covenant and the Flood. Whether it was dual wielding, vehicle hijacking, or the inclusion of new weapons and tweaks to existing guns, there was a whole lot to experiment with. Health packs were also removed entirely, leaving only the recharging shield, which I think on balance was the right decision. With 2 being a more linear affair than Combat Evolved, it works better in conjunction with the game's faster pace. That word, linear, is the big issue when it comes to Halo 2's campaign. One of my favourite aspects of the original was its mix of narrow and open environments, which gave it a wonderful rhythm. You'd transition from brawling in close quarters to battling across expansive areas that were linear but also open enough that they gave you plenty of angles of attack. In Halo 2, there are a lot of very repetitive indoor areas, which is a criticism that could be levelled at Combat Evolved, but unfortunately that issue isn't alleviated by its outdoor environments. There are some which give you a little bit of freedom, but for much of the game's runtime you feel like you're being shepherded through narrow hallways, whether you're indoors or out. 2's story is a grand tale of war and politics.
Are you questioning my decision?
No, Holy One. I only wish to express my concern that the brutes...
Recommissioning the Guard was a radical step. But recent events have made it abundantly clear that the elites can no longer guarantee our safety.
I shall relay your decision to the Council.
However, that story clashes violently with gameplay that pares back the sense of scale achieved during Combat Evolved, which is a shame. So often, there are sections which remind you of something from 2's predecessor, except there's less opportunity to explore off the beaten path. Compare Delta Halo's Scorpion run to the one featured in Assault on the Control Room, for example, or the Banshee sequence in The Great Journey to that in 2 Betrayals. There's also a significant gap in quality between Master Chief's levels and the Arbiter's. The Arbiter's missions during the first half of the game especially, I'm looking at you, the Arbiter and the Oracle, are pretty repetitive in terms of both gameplay and aesthetic, and they're certainly not the engaging introduction to a new playable character you would have perhaps hoped for. The number 2 is undoubtedly the perfect one for Combat Evolved's sequel, as it is definitely a game of 2 halves. Its plot and the cinematics which accompany it are breathtaking and show off Bungie's ability to weave an incredible space opera story quite unlike anything else in the genre. On the other hand, while Halo 2 does feel great to play, its level design and repetition means it loses quite a bit of the magic of the original when looking at its gameplay overall. It's still a great game and one I revisit regularly, but not quite as much as I do some of the other games in the series. For a long time, Halo Reach was for me the black sheep of Bungie's releases. I played it during a very busy period of my life while living with mates at university, a period when single-player gaming was far from being my #1 priority. Because of that, I rushed through the game, I didn't pay anywhere near enough attention, and I came away far less enthused about the experience than I am now. It was a good few years until I revisited it, and upon finishing the game a second time, I couldn't believe how dismissive I'd been. I've played it through countless times since then, and I think it's safe to say that Halo Reach is amazing. Reach takes a lot of what made Halo 3 ODST so successful and transplants it into a much grander experience, telling the tale of a group rather than the individual, weaving a more sobering story, spotlighting place as much as person. These are all parts of ODST that are just as prevalent in Reach. The stars of the show are Noble Team and the planet of Reach itself. A group of 6 Spartans, including player character Noble 6, the story is very heavily centred on them for the majority of the game's runtime. Past Halo titles would focus on Master Chief, but regularly bring in various members of the trilogy's supporting cast for extended stints, where Reach instead relies on Noble Team doing most of the heavy lifting. In a game like Halo 3, that wouldn't work. Its plot is so all-encompassing, so important on a galactic scale, that minimising the size of its cast would not be viable. In Halo Reach, a game about a single planet, it definitely is. You become invested in the group dynamic, in the team's success. They are the lens through which you view the conflict. This allowed Bungie to use them to fashion some of the most impactful moments in the series, the deaths of George and Kat, for example.
Better get going, 6, they're gonna need you down there. Listen, Reach has been good to me. Time has come to return the favour. Don't deny me this.
A slight criticism I would level at the story is that I think it could have done with a mission or two before the reveal of the Covenant earlier on, to give you more time to understand each member of Noble Team and how they interact with other members of the group, but Reach is already a long game, so that might have created issues with pacing. Ultimately, when I think of Master Chief's trilogy, I think about the conflict as much as I do about him. When I think about Reach, my first thoughts are always of Noble Team, and I think that's the greatest compliment I can give. Using Noble Team as expertly as they are would have perhaps been enough, but Reach itself is also used as a mirror for events. If some of the most memorable story beats are in Reach, then so too are some of the most unforgettable backdrops. The various angles you view Reach from and the colour palette used do a terrific job of conveying the changing status of the conflict. During the first half of the game, everything is blue and green. The planet's aesthetic is an inviting one, and it's somewhere you'd be happy to spend time. But as the game progresses and humanity and Noble Team's fortunes begin to fade, everything begins to burn, and oranges and reds become the dominant colours. Especially during Reach's middle third, Bungie also relishes the opportunity to constantly place you above the action so you can better witness the devastation. Tip of the Spear begins the trend, but it's used most effectively during Long Night of Solace, Exodus and New Alexandria, as you watch the planet turn from a paradise to a desolate wasteland. Examining Bungie's handling of Noble Team and the planet of Reach, it's evident to me that they were still at the height of their powers even as their time with the series drew to a close. That extends to the game's missions as well. I always point to Reach and 3 as being Halo's most consistent campaigns when it comes to the overall quality of its levels. 3 has lower lows, think Cortana, but also higher highs, the Ark and the Covenant for example, while Reach stays more towards the middle. There's not a single level I find a chore to get through, and there are plenty which I greatly look forward to. Like they did with structure and atmosphere in ODST, Bungie also continues to experiment. Long Night of Solace brought space combat to the series for the very first time, while New Alexandria introduced randomised objectives. Some new features are more successful than others, granted, but they all demonstrate Bungie's continued willingness to rethink the Halo formula. I'd have loved to have seen what they did next if they had remained with the series. Tying everything together is Reach's soundtrack. I know I sound like a broken record praising every Bungie developed OST, but there's a reason for that. They're all amazing. Reach's stands out to me as it's an entirely new score for a big budget title which uses little to none of that featured in the Master Chief trilogy, and yet it still perfectly sits alongside everything which came before. It's just as strong a collection of tracks as any other in the series, and there are too many examples to list of them doing an exemplary job of underscoring events.
Maybe, but according to Holland, the Covenant are still hunting for something. Where does he get off calling a demolition a priority one?
Come on, get in! Let's go, come on!
Before we move on, it would also be remiss of me not to mention one bone of contention among many fans of the series, the way Reach's story messes with pre-established lore. For me, someone not overly familiar with the book The Fall of Reach, it's never been a massive issue, but on the other hand, based off what I do know, I can also completely understand why some would be so frustrated by Bungie's choices. It rewrites part of the wider Halo story, which probably didn't need to be changed. All in all, Reach is a marvellous experience which, along with ODST, proved that Halo could still flourish without Master Chief being involved. It's a moving tale of a group of Spartans doing their best in dire circumstances, and it's so good that on another day it could have even sneaked in above the next game on my list. Concluding a trilogy can be a tricky thing, with many franchises failing to round theirs out in a satisfactory manner. Bungie, however, had absolutely no problem doing that with Halo 3. Halo 3 is an interesting game to me, as it actually takes a little while to get going, but once it does, it never lets up for a second until its end credits roll. Its first couple of levels, Sierra 117 and Crow's Nest, are by no means bad, but they're a slower start than could perhaps have been expected. But then you arrive at Savo Highway and the game begins to open up. The Storm, the mission featuring the series' first proper Scarab battle, is mind-blowing, and from there on out, it's mostly gold. Some might argue that Floodgate is only middling. I disagree, but I can see why some would, and Cortana is very dodgy indeed, but the Ark, the Covenant and Halo are all superb. The Ark and the Covenant in particular deserve the utmost praise, as they are, in my mind, two of the franchise's very best, with the Covenant actually being the best full stop. The sheer variety contained within all of those levels is outstanding. In terms of setting, you trek through a jungle, travel across desert plains, shoot your way through industrial areas, fight your way through a flood-infested High Charity, and even revisit a few classic areas during your time spent on Installation 08. There are battles with one Scarab, battles with two Scarabs, Hornet rides, Scorpion runs, some of the most open environments in the series, skirmishes against the Flood in the snow, and even a Warthog run. You are never stuck doing one thing for very long at all, and that gives the game a remarkable sense of pace. Halo 3 is one of the most balanced titles in the entire series, rivaled only by Halo Reach. Yes, Cortana is a bit rubbish, but beyond that, there isn't a single level I don't look forward to playing whenever I revisit the game. It maintains a consistent quality throughout, and every so often throws in some of the best sections or entire missions in the franchise. That is coupled with a story that admittedly doesn't reach the highs of Halo 2, few games do in all honesty, but that finishes the tale of Master Chief and humanity's war against the Covenant with extreme class.
I remember how this war started, what your kind did to mine. I can't forgive them. But you have my thanks for standing by him to the end. Hard to believe he's dead.
Were it so easy.
Halo Combat Evolved was a game with an amazing first half that didn't quite manage to finish as strong, creating an uneven experience. Halo 2 had a brilliant story, the best in the series, but when compared to other titles, its gameplay felt restrictive. Halo 3 plays well, has a great story, and doesn't suffer from extended dips in quality in certain areas like its predecessors. To say it's well-rounded would be an understatement. On the subject of story, even though 2 may take the crown, there are still so many memorable moments packed into 3. The scenes in Voy around the campaign's midpoint are awesome, basically everything in the Covenant is magic, the team up with the Flood especially, and the game's epilogue is touching. As per usual, the soundtrack which accompanies them, and that is used during gameplay, is unrivaled in the FPS genre too. In that regard, 3 is one of my favourites, as a lot of the tracks used, their themes and motifs, had been built up since Combat Evolved, and even though you might have thought the trilogy's soundtrack couldn't get any better, Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore continue to surprise. Finally, while 3's gameplay may have seen less changes than the transition between Combat Evolved and 2, there were nonetheless several welcome tweaks and additions. The most impactful by far was the introduction of equipment, with pickups like the Bubble Shield, Power Drain and Regenerator helping make the sandbox more rewarding than ever. There were also a ton of new vehicles added, with the Brute Chopper and the Mongoose being firm favourites of mine. Even in a game as good as Halo 3, however, there is still room for improvement, although my biggest gripes are with what's not included rather than what is. For one thing, I'd have loved the campaign to have lasted a little while longer. Whenever I replay 3, it always feels to me like the story treads water for a while until the end of Savo Highway, at which point it begins to pick up steam and quickly gets going proper. As mentioned, from there it's fantastic, but there is also so much going on that I do occasionally wonder whether the story is wrapped up a tad too quickly. There are so many big plot points to take in across each of the game's levels that the more personal character moments take a back seat, as there simply isn't enough time to include them what with everything else going on. To continue in the same vein, Cortana is also criminally underused. Master Chief may be the trilogy's main character, but Cortana is definitely a close second. For most of Combat Evolved and 2, she is by your side, and her lack of screen time during 3 is sorely felt, especially considering the only times she does appear are during the terrible slow motion scenes within levels which are irritating at best. Your reuniting with her is so good.
But so much of me is wrong. Out of place. You might be too late.
You know me. When I make a promise.
You keep it. I do know how to pick 'em.
Lucky me.
But by the time you rescue Cortana, 3 is basically over, and so you get to spend way less time with her than you should. It is by far the biggest letdown in the game, in my opinion. Even with these quibbles, Halo 3 is tremendous. Concluding a trilogy is difficult at the best of times, particularly one with Halo's scope, and any misstep could have left a huge black mark on a franchise which had been so good for so many years. Even with that being the case, Bungie managed to cap things off with great class, finishing the story in a way that felt just right, ensuring Halo's Combat Evolved 2 and 3 will go down as one of the best trilogies in gaming. Halo Combat Evolved is, in my view, the best game in the entire series. Before I explain why, I also wish to add that context is incredibly important when talking about this title in particular. Compared to later entries, it lacks features, has a simpler story, looks fairly basic, and struggles with repetition, especially later on in its campaign. At launch, however, there was no other console first-person shooter which came even remotely close to matching it. You cannot talk about Halo without acknowledging the colossal impact it had on the genre. Looking at its controls alone, it changed the game completely and proved shooters were viable on console, with its dedicated grenade and melee buttons, use of both analog sticks for moving and shooting, and just the right amount of aim assist. Gameplay-wise, it was a similar story, with it also featuring a 2-weapon system, recharging shield mechanic, vehicular combat on a scale unseen elsewhere, and some of the best enemy AI in the business. Many of these innovations weren't entirely new and had appeared in other games, but Halo was the first to combine them all as part of one cohesive package. It was practically solely responsible for popularising the majority of them, and they quickly became staples of the genre. I am not over-exaggerating when I say I could scarcely believe what I was playing the first time I got my hands on it. You might hear some people nowadays say, "It's aged really badly, how can it possibly be the best Halo?" But again, you have to think about it in the context of its release. Nothing on console came close, nothing would come close for a long time, and without it, I'm not convinced the Xbox would have been successful enough to warrant the release of the 360 a few years later. As much as I love so many other games in the series, none of them are as groundbreaking as the original. Also, a quick side note here, do not listen to anyone who makes the argument that Halo Combat Evolved was good for a console game but wasn't anything special on PC. That is absolute poppycock. No game on PC included the sheer scale of encounters mixed with vehicular combat and all the innovations I've just run through, and if Halo had come out on PC at the same time it did on Xbox, it would have flourished all the same. A big reason my love for Combat Evolved knows no bounds is because of its first half, which remains one of the highest quality segments in any game I've ever played. At first, you might be tricked into thinking you'll mostly be exploring narrow corridors, but then, before you know it, you're sniping enemies from a distance under cover of night, exploring an entire island however you choose, or making your way through a swamp and facility where something has seemingly gone very wrong.
Stay back! Stay back! You're not turning me into one of those things! I'll blow your brains out! Get away from me! Ah! Ah! Don't touch me, you freaks! I won't be like you, I'll die first! Find your own hiding place, the monsters are everywhere!
Two of its missions, the Silent Cartographer and 343 Guilty Spark, are among the best in the entire FPS genre, and who can forget about the jaw-dropping introduction of the Flood, one of gaming's greatest twists which left me, and I'm sure many others, completely stunned. Halo's second half doesn't quite stick the landing, unfortunately, with more and more repetition creeping its way into the level design in particular, but there are nonetheless still plenty of highlights. Two Betrayals' multi-faction battles with the Flood and the Covenant are superb, the reveal of Captain Key's fate is horrifying and fantastic in equal measure, and the Moore's Warthog run to conclude the game is a tremendous set piece. The whole thing is such a joy to play, even in the present, and while it without doubt feels less complex than its sequels, in a lot of ways I really like that. It serves as a reminder that even when a lot of the newer features added to the series had been stripped away, the foundations upon which everything was built were extraordinary to begin with. Bungie also deserves a huge amount of credit for paying just as much attention to Combat Evolved's artistic side as they did its gameplay. Its soundtrack is my most listened to video game OST by far, and so many of my favourite moments in terms of gameplay or story are deeply intertwined with the music which was playing during them. Also, need I remind you that although Halo is now quite basic visually, even compared to 2, it was jaw-dropping back in 2001. The environments you fought your way across were enormous, and the sense of scale was unparalleled. I'm sure many of you will remember those first few steps out onto Installation 04 as fondly as I do. It really did feel like you were exploring a vast alien world. Last, but certainly not least, the cast of characters you meet for the very first time shine too. A lot of them are archetypes, such as the composed space marine, the loudmouthed army sergeant, the quippy sidekick, or the noble leader, but they had a layer of depth added to them which made them so much more interesting than those featured in the majority of shooters at the time.
The Flood is spreading. If we activate Halo's defenses, we can wipe them out.
You have no idea how this ring works, do you? Why the Forerunners built it? Halo doesn't kill Flood, it kills their food. Humans, Covenant, whatever. We're all equally edible. The only way to stop the Flood is to starve them to death.
Leaning into the sense of familiarity that came with those characters allowed Bungie to focus on the story and building out the wider world to a far greater extent than they would have been able to otherwise, and it's that extended universe and the unanswered questions surrounding it which drew me into Halo as much as anything else. There's not much more I can add here other than to say that Halo Combat Evolved is not just the best Halo, but also one of the most important titles in video game history. It launched a series that would quickly become synonymous with the Xbox brand, and with good reason, and it showed the world that anything PC shooters were capable of, consoles could do just as well, if not better. Thank you boys, girls and Spartans for watching a video that's a little bit longer than usual. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, as I'd love to hear from you all, and touch wood, we'll cross paths again soon.